Well, let's begin. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the second day of the Asia Dramaturgs Network symposium. My name's Peter Eckersall, and I come from Australia originally, but I work in the City University of New York, where I teach theatre and performance studies. And I'm also working as a dramaturg, principally for the Not Yet It's Difficult theatre group based in Melbourne, the artistic director of which is David Pledger, and David will be speaking this afternoon on one of the panels. We are going to, in this session, run it more as a roundtable rather than as a series of presentations. So each of the speakers will have between 5 and 8 minutes to introduce some of the questions and themes around the topic today, which I'll introduce in a minute. Then we'll move into more of a conversation among the panelists, and then we'll move out from that into a conversation between the panelists and the audience. So there's a kind of three-part dramaturgy planned here. We are recording this event for documentation purposes. So just remember that please, if you speak from the audience, if you're going to ask a question, please use a microphone so that we can capture your thoughts and words of wisdom. Am I translating everything you say now? No. Q&A. You can. If Kentaro has any questions, he can ask you what that means, and you can just. But no, you don't have to translate this section. Yeah. Okay. So we, I think, have a really exciting topic this morning, and we also have a very distinguished panel of speakers, quite a remarkable panel, in fact. And okay. Okay. Please. Okay. There will be. There will be no translation until the Q&A, where there will be translation available for Japanese speakers. We will have some whispering going on for one of our speakers, Kentaro Matsui, who will have an assistance from our translator so he can, if there's any bits of the conversation that he doesn't follow, but it won't be simultaneous translation. So, どうぞ。
今回の、セッションはすべて英語で行われてそちらには通訳はつかないんですけれども、少し最後に Q&A の時間を設けますので、その時に逐次で、もし必要であれば通訳が入ることになっています。そのことだけご了承ください。
ありがとうございます。Okay, so let's begin. Before I introduce the panel, if you'll indulge me, I just thought I might offer one or two introductory comments around the theme of the panel. Mainly to frame perhaps a series of questions that we can address in the panel today, which is going to run for 2 hours, so we've got lots of time. Now, this panel comes to us with a theme, probably quite a difficult theme of Asian dramaturgies, and so we're essentially, I think, interrogating here two fairly difficult terms, neither of which have a precise definition. So, of course, dramaturgy is a term that we've been discussing both in the last meeting and this one, and I think we're all aware of the fact that the term has multiple meanings and is in many instances an ambiguous term. But I also wanted to, I guess, raise the spectre of the term Asia and Asian, because, of course, this is also a term that could be subject to quite a serious critique, I think, in terms of what it actually means. And then how the relationship between these terms inflect is going to be one of our, I think, key questions. So I'd just like to pose a few questions in the introduction. What is to be gained from, I think, trying to or attempting to dislocate the term dramaturgy from its historical connections to Western theatre practice and or modern theatre practice? Because in dislocating the term from a Western history, I think we risk assuming that term has a comfortable relationship to Western theatrical practice to begin with. And I would suggest that, in fact, it doesn't. The term is contested within Western theatre traditions. And of course the term is not an English term. It's a term that is associated with ancient Greek language. It comes from a language that is now dead. So it's a dead language term. Of course it comes with historical baggage, and it comes to us with a set of provocations, I think, that we'll address. Much of the interest in dramaturgy in this conference, and indeed in an organisation like TPAM, I think is not to do with so-called traditional dramaturgical practices, but it's very much to do with what I would term new dramaturgy. Dramaturgy that is associated with processes of making contemporary performance, as opposed to script-based dramaturgies a la G.E. Lessing and the improvement of the text or the play, instructions to the playwright to write better plays. I think we're dealing with a much more complicated and interdisciplinary use of the term dramaturgy. So we have to acknowledge the fact that when we're dealing with the term dramaturgy, we're dealing with a term that is already dislocated from its own theatrical traditions. It's already, in a sense, rejecting a certain kind of normative Western theatrical history. So in bringing the term into this context, I think we need to be very precise about what we mean by dramaturgy and how we're using it. Of course, I mentioned that Asia is also a difficult term. It's perhaps a more problematic term than dramaturgy, in that it is a term that has a lot more currency in many, many different contexts and locations, be they political, economic, cultural, historical, and an attempt to discover a kind of an Asian dramaturgy might risk certain kinds of homogenization. It raises a lot of, I think, very interesting questions about cultural politics, about ownership of terms. It has all sorts of interesting contexts to do with locations of production and locations of dissemination of the term, vis-a-vis perhaps Singapore and Japan, two countries that are very much involved in a sense, promoting discussion around this term. There's no money from China, there's no skin in the game from China around the term at the moment, perhaps. So what are we actually doing when we're thinking about Asian in relation to dramaturgy? We could, if you'll indulge me, because I am a trained scholar, somebody who, I can hear the ghosts of my professors saying, you have to immediately deconstruct the term Asian as your first operation. We could turn to some interesting cultural theory, into Asia cultural studies perspectives, or perhaps the work of a Chinese scholar who talks about the need to decolonize Asian studies. Asia as method proposes an idea of a decolonization, or a process of critiquing understandings of Asia through an enlarged conversation among Asian scholars, Asian artists, Asian cultural practitioners, and so on and so forth. So one could argue that what you've proposed here in your dramaturgy of this forum is a kind of Asia as method context. So that might be an interesting thing to consider. So, and finally, we've got the question of flows, and I think most of us are familiar with the way that perhaps Japanese popular culture flows through the region and becomes very prominent in relation to contemporary performance popular cultures, not theatre cultures so much. And there's a lot of work on how these kind of ideas circulate through the region and create new communities of people who gather around a relationship to a particular cultural form, or a particular artist, or a particular fan base, or a particular set of cultural practices that start to define themselves not so much as citizens of a nation, but people who are members of a certain community. A community of people who like manga, a community of fans of Hatsune Miki, a community of people who are Buto practitioners, a community of people who do Augusto Boal style performance, so on and so forth. So maybe that's something to consider as well. Anyway, that's enough of the theory. It's a bit early in the morning for that kind of very serious stuff. I'd now like to introduce the panel. First we have Anuradha Kapur, who's an academic and theatre practitioner. She's Professor of Acting and Directing and Director at the National School of Drama, New Delhi in 2013. She's continued teaching and publishing and making work, co-founder of the theatre group Vivadi, and a very distinguished arts worker and scholar. And I won't read out the full biographies, but they are here in English and Japanese. Charlene Rajendran is a theatre educator, researcher and practitioner who currently works at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and is also very well known for her work, both artistic practice and theoretical work and pedagogy as well. Kentaro Matsui, on the end, is Director in culture, of the Culture Center of Fujimi City, located in Saitama Prefecture, which is a very interesting location for an arts center outside of Tokyo, in the north of Tokyo. Those who are not familiar, a location that has a long history with perhaps small industries, farming, and rural communities. So this is an area where the arts are coming into contact with perhaps communities of people who are not necessarily expecting to be involved in the arts in their daily life. And then finally we have Marion D'Cruz, who choreographs, performs, produces and teaches full-time at the dance faculty of Aswara, the National Academy of Arts, Culture and Heritage in Malaysia. Marianne is, as you all know, a pioneer of contemporary dance in Malaysia and a founding member of the Five Arts Centre. And the biography would go on for pages if we had time. But so with those introductions, I'd just like to invite the contributions from our panel, 5 to 8 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a wider discussion before turning to the floor. So we didn't decide this, but would anybody like to volunteer to go first? You're on my left and the microphone is here, so...
Some disadvantages of the name starting with A. It's like what happens in school forever. Thank you very much. I'm going to present a sort of willful history of some of the practices that have happened in India over the last some years. I'm going to try and annotate some of the words that are here, or something which, for instance, is in discussion all the time in India, roots and traditions. Dramaturgical thinking, the action of translating and materializing ideas, the effect and affect of stage geometry, architecture, costume, color, the shape of the body, the attributes of heroes and heroines, are part of ancient manuals in India. The Natya Shastras, supposedly between 2000 BC to 2000 AD, and Dasharupak around the 10th century. Now, clearly, they propose, for instance, that nearness and distance, color and shape produce a scheme of relationships between actor, spectator, and play materials. In countries that have long traditions of performance, such as India, the need to critically annotate these continuities becomes the need actually to point to ruptures and interruptions and disalignments. Otherwise, we tend to make a history which says that what happens or what is described in the ancient texts is how it materializes in today's world. To put a performance in the discursive field as also the body as figuration in the discursive field would be possibly one of the annotations of dramaturgy as we might know it. This interruption that I'm trying to make with notions about tradition and dramaturgical thinking becomes all the more important when the past as memory and the past as transmission becomes something that gets given to a student, a pupil, a shivsha, without any mediation. This is one part of the belief of the guru-shishya relationship, to which I'll come just now. This interruption that I'm trying to say is like pulling the brake, as Benjamin would say, to stop and see why we need to critically annotate certain historically sort of read terms. I don't think that the ancient texts, some of them are called texts on dramaturgy, but I think the important thing is that we try and see where they become important to us in contemporary practice. And it looks to me that one of the important breakages with a kind of history about how to read modern theater comes at a point when, in the 1980s or so, when a corpus of work develops that has been done by women directors. And I think it develops because the work of certain women or certain kinds of practices come in collision with what is seen as dominant modern Indian theater dramaturgy. So let me put out what some of these ideas of theater practice in the 1980s brings forward, and I would hazard saying there is a kind of tradition of that comes into being about what is material on stage, but I'll come back to that. So this, in the 1980s, questions several sorts of roles in theater making, and the sort of rematerialization that happens about roles, and a counter-narrative of sorts is put in place. And as I said earlier, this is willful reading. One of the counter-narratives is about the relationship of pedagogy. The guru, the shishya, the disciple and the teacher. This kind of teaching methodology gets into some kind of questioning, and the notion of reproduction in teaching. There is a questioning of family lineage, of patronage, of inclusion and exclusion. And I want to just give an example that a very dear friend of mine and a music scholar gives often. This is Vidya Rao. And she talks of a particular music tradition, which is a tradition of music that was actually primarily that of the courtesans of the 19th century. The music tradition called Thumri is now a very established tradition. It was not allowed into the Indian radio till about the 1930s. You had to say when you entered, even directly after independence, 1947, when you entered the radio station, you had to show a paper saying that you were not from a courtesan family. Anyhow, this music tradition was learnt by many men and sung by many men, but nobody in the lineage is marked as having been taught by a woman. So I'm just marking this, understanding that this kind of guru-shishya, this teacher-student relationship, also began to be rethought of in the 1980s. One of the things that therefore the 1980s and the women's work mark out at that point is that there is a field of knowledge that a spectator must navigate and negotiate. It doesn't come to the spectator unmediated and without interruptions, as well as without questions. Therefore, this a certain kind of narrative in Indian theatre which says that since we have talked of dramaturgy, what happens today is exactly the same. I'm trying to actually mark out to say that one of the things that actually makes a difference is what does this kind of dramaturgy make the audience do? So putting the spectator centrally into the argument. A fast forward. Some of the work in the 1980s and then onwards has an interest in mixes and hybridities. it has a interest in bringing up the idea of figuration, especially that of women, as the example that I gave you of Tumri as well. The idea of the production of gender is brought up, and therefore the idea of identity, and therefore the idea of India, and therefore the idea of Indianness, and therefore of the nation. I would suggest with these kinds of questionings in the 1980s, many sutures about the nation are opened up, and they are not, they remain undone till today. They don't get tied. What is left undone is then a notion of what is Indian theatre, what is Indian dramaturgy. And it opens it out to say, we can't talk about it as Indian dramaturgy, dramaturgy about roots, or dramaturgy about tradition. What also then destabilizes the position of the guru, the transmitter of knowledge, is collaboration, devising, multi-authorship, which would be very much a part of some of the works that have happened with women directors who have worked with collectives. The guru lineage that I wanted to point to earlier, that I pointed to earlier, then questions pasts, memory, embodiment, and that there is a continuity about what is truly Indian that passes through the body from the guru to the pupil. Therefore, an idea of reimagining the role of the pedagogue comes in, both in the classroom as how to first work with teaching without actually taking on yourself the burden of too much knowledge. I want to just annotate this slightly. When I began directing, and we were working a lot with devising, and I'm sure all friends here would have the experience, I remember at the drama school, I was asked, have you done your homework? Do you want us to do everything? Why wouldn't you tell us what to do? So there is a relationship about how you want to transmit certain kinds of work and what is seen as collective. There was an interest at that time in popular forms between questioning the category of high and low art, and there has been an interest which is continuing in melodrama, in the Baroque, in excess, that is excess in costume, color, and objects, bringing in objects of the everyday, for instance, cooking, for instance, working with actual everyday material, the material of labor in a woman's life. So producing a certain kind of polydimensionality and involving touch, smell, taste on the stage. And that become material then, in that time, begins to be seen as subversive to a certain kind of austere modernism that was part of the 1950s of the theater post-independence. This excess, it appears to a certain discourse, or like wrecking a certain moderate organization of knowledge on stage, and perforates illusionism, but also in some senses, by introducing melodrama, questions the trope that is very common in India about the theater of roots, that there are roots which take you down to an authentic resource to which you can relate at any time. There have been lots of arguments, especially with women, about theater of roots and what roots the women directors of the 1980s had. I am therefore putting forth a claim on the past in order to recompose it, and in order to say that there are certain pasts that become more official than others, and that we need to question why certain pasts are more official. So gender destabilization and masquerade, spectatorship and a reading of what happens to the spectator in the play, the material that is brought onto stage, become markers of something that has, I think, been now very much a part of the debate about what is contemporary and what is modern in Indian theatre. And I would mark this position as being part of some of the practices that begin in the 1980s. I'm not marking the 1980s as some kind of originary moment, but I am marking it as a moment that brings together certain questions. And one of the questions, as I said in the beginning, was of figuration, and something that we joked about, a common quotation, which when we work with bringing the figure of woman, an Indian woman on the stage, is that we know that the emperor has no clothes, but the empress has no body. So with that, we begin and we end. Thank you very much.
So we'll move straight on to our second speaker, and I think we'll ask Charlene, is that all right for you to speak? So thank you. Over to you. Thank you.
My name does begin with C, so I will accept, although it's very hard to go after Anuradha. However, there's some nice synergy, so I'm quite happy to go after Anuradha. I want to talk about multiplicity and negotiating difference, because I come from Malaysia and Singapore. I think it's fair to say I come from both now. Because even if Marion glares at me, I've lived in Malaysia most of my life, but the last 15 years of my life I've been in Singapore. And when I was born, they were both one country. That tells you how old I am. But I had a strong relationship with Singapore growing up because my aunt, with whom I was very close, was there. Anyway, these two societies are a particular kind of Asia. They are Southeast Asia, but within Southeast Asia as well, they operate with a certain kind of plurality, mixture, and difference. Officially, both countries have this similar multiculturalism policy, where we are all defined by our race. And if you're Malay or Chinese or Indian, quite clearly, even if you're mixed, there's a certain notion of some sort of originary culture that you come from. But then there are some of us who are other, and I point to Natalie, I think you're other too. And although I have an Indian surname, because my grandparents are from Sri Lanka, at the time there was a political process in which the Sri Lankans in Malaysia said, we're not Indian. And there was a certain snobbery about it, but as a result, I am officially other, although now that's become a lot more porous. And these things stay with you, obviously, because when you fill in a form, you still have to fill it in. And in Singapore, I have to fill in these forms as well. And in Malaysia, you also have to fill in a form about which religion you belong to. So you're officially of a certain race and of a certain religion. In Singapore, you have the option of being free thinker. In Malaysia, there isn't that option. So the kinds of performances that emerge in these contexts are imbued with these kinds of official negotiations of difference, classifications, parallel streams that officially don't intersect, except in food and sometimes clothing, where you are allowed to have mixes and fusions. But otherwise, in the official arena, you present Chinese culture, modern and classical or Indian culture, as separate. So, two theatre practitioners, pioneers, who consciously in their work questioned this and sought to rethink how the nation needs to resist this way of thinking by offering on stage live performances that reconfigure these ideas of rigid, fixed, essentialized difference, were Kuo Pao Kun from Singapore and Krishnajit from Malaysia, both of whom, sadly, are no longer with us and passed too soon within a couple of years of each other. And I think they offer frames for thinking about how contemporary work has tried to navigate through this notion of difference. And interestingly, the 1980s, I think, was also a moment where, or a decade where certain things were marked, certainly in the work of Krishan and Pao Kun. For Krishan, Five Arts Centre was formed in 1984. He made a shift from doing Malay language theatre completely because of a certain nationalist ideal that he took on for a while, towards doing English language theatre that allowed for that mix. And in Singapore, of course, Pao Kun's detention and then release and then shift towards doing theatre that was less socialist Chinese language oriented, towards a different kind of hybrid or difference, emerged, which then led to the flourish of the 1990s. And I think we look nowadays at the 1990s as this golden time, but really what happened in the 1980s was foundational towards that being allowed to happen. Of course, the financial boom that occurred in the 1990s made a big difference in terms of how, funding could affect that. So one of the things that both Krishan and Pao Kun did is they created work. Pao Kun was also a playwright and a director. Krishan wasn't a playwright, but he was a theatre critic who wrote regularly. They both wrote about work, not necessarily their work, but about what they were seeing, what they were thinking, and they were dramaturging performance in relation to society, nation, politics, culture, the region. They were making links because they saw a gap in a certain kind of scholarship. There weren't theatre studies departments at the time in Malaysia and Singapore. And they recognized the need to have discourses that were emerging from this contemporary frame. And in their writings, there's constant reference to this question of how to navigate difference, differently, but nonetheless. And so two ways in which they talk about it, I think, offer frames, if not lenses, for understanding how new dramaturgies are still present and still being built upon these ideas. So Pao Kun talked about something called open culture. And for him, open culture is defined as being rooted in one specific culture, but not necessarily the culture that you are racially defined by. It can be any culture of your choice. But being rooted in a culture is not about going back to an originary moment as much as it is about learning the vocabulary, the philosophy, the ethos, and therefore being deeply soaked in one culture, whatever that culture be. And from that position and groundedness of being, in a way, then being open to all other cultures and taking them on with the capacity to negotiate. I mean, Pao Kun talked about how it's not about bilingualism, it's about biculturalism. Multiculturalism then is not about having separate things that exist in parallel but intertwine. And open culture, I think, you talked about the open dramaturgy and the nation getting opened up and remaining open, these sutures. I think that's in many respects a push that Pao Kun was making towards acknowledging that, yes, there are these very strong entrenched cultures that operate politically, socially, and personally in people's lives, Malay, Chinese, Indian, etc., because the other doesn't really work as an other. But nonetheless, there is so much more at work and operating. And as a result, the neglect of these things leads to a very authoritative way of understanding culture, authoritarian. So Pao Kun's Mama Looking for Her Cat, in which he writes and directs a play where different languages are present and no surtitles are offered to assume that there's one dominant language with which to navigate through this, is significant. Also, at the time, English is gaining prominence, and the two main characters speak Chinese and Tamil to each other, and they don't understand each other. These are two older citizens who are engaged in displacement from their families and their societies because of the English language policy. And they speak to each other in one speaks Chinese, the other one speaks Tamil, and they understand each other. So there's a metaphor, there's a symbolism, obviously, about the human being's capacity to navigate difference despite linguistic distances, you might say. Krishan offers the notion of multiculturalism within the body and talks about how his work had been persistently trying to excavate this. And for me, that's very interesting, that it's excavation rather than layering on like another patina. It's so distinctly not a melting pot. And I think that's a way in which Singapore, Malaysian, Southeast Asian kinds of difference are being navigated in Krishan's work. So excavating this multiculturalism in the body for Krishan also involved issues of language, but not just language as Malay, Chinese, Indian, but the different Malays and the different Chinese languages and the different Englishes, plus within Hokkien, different kinds of Hokkien. Within Malay, different kinds of Malay. Formal, non-formal, street, Kelantan, Penang, etc. And Krishan consciously learnt Malay in the 70s, became more fluent in it than most Malaysians, read it like a scholar, spoke it like a scholar, wrote Malay as well, and learned the language as a politic of becoming Malaysian that I think is very, very significant. He has been criticized for endorsing a certain kind of elevation of Malay rights, but in the 70s, it was a very different period where I think being someone who grew up in a Punjabi-speaking home, having education in English, probably having spoken bazaar Malay or street Malay, but then realizing, okay, if I'm going to be viable, I've got to have language that I can wield. So I'll learn it. No big deal. In fact, it gives me more power. So then language for him is not just something you grow up with and something that's just natural and something that's just there. It's also a political choice. So the multiculturalism that is excavated, I think, relies on this intent and discipline. And for me, that's a dramaturging of life that then translates into performance making. It's not separate. It's intertwined. And multiculturalism within the bodies is exemplified in a range of Krishan's work, but the one that perhaps stands out for me is something called A Chance Encounter, which happened in the late 1990s. It was a devised work with two actors, both very strong, confident, talented women, Farida Marikan and Fu Mei Lin, whose life stories intertwine with two fictional characters who meet each other at a cosmetic sales counter in a busy shopping mall. And I think these kinds of stories that emerge, like Mama, the old Chinese lady and Indian man meeting, and the chance encounter of the elderly Malay woman and the Chinese cosmetic sales girl, are the kinds of stories that emerge when these dramaturgies inform choices and options for performance making. Thank you.
Who will speak next? Will we stick with the alphabet or will we go in order of the line?
Let's go down the line.
Okay, Marion, would you use that microphone over there? And Kentaro will speak last, so, yep.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hi, good morning, everyone. So you see here you have the academics with the academic language, and here you have the practitioner with the non-academic language. I thought I would talk about what I call
Strategies of Invisible Dramaturgy in the work of Five Arts Center. And I use the word invisible dramaturgy referring to the lack of a designated person who acts as the dramaturg, but dramaturgy is going on, which we've been talking about a lot yesterday. I have two examples. The first is co-direction. So Five Arts Center was formed in the 1980s, and right from the 1980s, there have been a number of significant projects that have been co-directed. One of the first was Ong Keng Sen and Krishan co-directing in the 1980s. So I guess, Charles, this business of what was happening in the 1980s, which then created a certain kind of ground for the next levels. Krishan and Keng Sen co-directed in the 80s. The first project was Three Children, and Claire's here. And during that time, I don't think Krishan had ever co-directed. But I think what was interesting, looking back on that process right now, is so they co-directed. It was a Malaysian play by Liao Puitin. And the discussions that went on between Krishan and Keng Sen into the wee hours of the morning in Krishan's hotel room, where I would be a fly on the wall, would be what, looking back now, would be that process of dramaturgy. And there were more hours of that discussion than there were hours on the rehearsal floor. And it was a fascinating dialogue that went on between the two, which should have been recorded, but unfortunately only sits in my memory. And Krishan went on to, Three Children was done in 1988 and then remounted again in 1991 when it toured to Japan. Krishan was very particular in who he would co-direct with. But in 1995, he did a big project called Skin Trilogy, which involved 6 visual artists. And to get that project going, he worked in collaboration with a visual artist. This was not co-direction, but he brought in Wong Hoi Cheong to sort of curate the visual art section of it, and Krishan was directing. So the visual artists had installations in the gallery, and then the performance happened all over the National Art Gallery, the National Art Gallery of that time. And with having established that relationship with Hoi Cheong in 1995, they went on to co-direct Family in 1998, which was a site-specific event that happened in an old abandoned house in Kuala Lumpur. Again, a Liao Puitin play, which was performed all over the house and had multiple scenes going on at one time, parallel text, so that the audience had to choose where they were going, and so on and so forth. And I think Family was recently done here in, Ken? Last year? Yeah, here in Japan. So that also was, and again, many discussions and hours of this discussions between Wong Hoi Cheong and Krishan, which, looking back now, seems to me like a dramaturgical process that was going on. And the third example was something I did in 2012 called Dream Country, as part of the Singapore Arts Festival at that time. It's a very long story how the project happened, but Ki Hong was responsible for that. And it was based on a piece that I had done in 1988 called Urn Piece. And the Singapore version, the original version, had 3 dancers coming out of 3 large urns filled with water. And the Singapore version had 35 performers coming out of 35 urns, an outdoor performance. So when we did that, we had 6 directors working. And 3 of them are in the room, 4 of them are in the room. How bizarrely wonderful is that? So what it was I came up with a scheme where 4 directors were picked in Singapore, all women. The performance also had all women. And each director worked with a group of 7 or 8 performers. And they were, and then there were 2 of us from KL, myself and Anne James. And there was a scheme given and a kind of structure given, and then they would work, and then we would come down and look at the material, and eventually the 6 of us put the performance, a 45-minute performance, put it together at the Esplanade, outdoors. The directors who are in the room are Claire Wong, who's at the back, Natalie, who's right there, Charlene is here, and myself. So again, looking back at that whole process, the amount of discussion, negotiation, fights, tempers, tears, alcohol, all of which went on, that process, I think, and I was trying to think this morning, so was I the dramaturg in that process? Which I will leave that, maybe Natalie and Claire will say, was I the negotiator to keep the peace and to keep everybody safe? Ombudsman. I can't even say that word. Okay, so, but again, it was six directors working in that collaborative way. So the idea of co-direction for me is a scheme that has been happening within Five Arts Center, and I'm sure in many other places. And inbuilt into that is the dramaturgy. The second example I want to talk about is something that's been developing in Malaysia, and I think especially in Japan and maybe other places, of the creative producer. So in the past, the producer sort of served the vision of the director or the choreographer. So, choreographer, director says jump, producer says how high. At least that's how I've worked as a producer, and you just deliver, and you try and make the vision of the director happen as a good producer. But in the last few years, the idea of a creative producer who's not just the person who's going to make your work happen, but is going to, in a sense, work with you and give you creative input, is not a co-director, but is a creative producer. And I have worked with June Tan as a creative producer, and she's in the room as well. And the first piece, and it would not have happened without June. It was a bizarre thing that I came up with called 2-minute solos, which if we have time later, I'll describe what it was. But, I had this kind of idea, and I go, hey, June, I want to do this, And it was that discussion with June and her, asking me all those questions and saying, okay, what about this? What about this? No, let's do this, and let's put these people and not this person, and so on and so forth, that eventually led to the event happening in 2013 and 14. So I think that also is an interesting strategy that's happening, the creative producer, and then the question would be, then is that creative producer also doing dramaturgy in that process? Thank you.
And we'll hear from our final speaker now, Kentaro Matsui, but Matsui-san's going to speak in Japanese, and there'll be translation for this, so onegaishimasu.
僕が世田谷パブリックシアターでプロデューサーをやってた時の経験をシェアするところから始めます。
I would like to start from my experience of serving as a producer at Setagaya Public Theater.
2005年にホテルグランドアジアという作品を、タイ、マレーシア、インドネシア、フィリピン、シンガポールと日本 から集まって、作りました。
In 2005, we created a piece called Hotel Grand Asia with artists from Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, and Japan.
でその時に2年間ぐらいのプロセスでワークショップをいっぱいやったんですけど、それぞれの国が持っている物語とか神話とかっていうのをみんなでシェアするってことをやりました。でその中で神話みたいなものもあるんですけど、動物が出てくるような物語というのがかなり共通したものとして僕ら持っているんだなってことを発見しました。
In the 2-year process of this creation, we had a series of workshops where we shared different stories and myths from different countries. And from this experience, we started to realize that we share in common these different stories or myths that had animals as the characters.
あともちろんアジア、特に東南アジアと東アジアっていうふうに分けてもですね、中国とインドの文化的な影響っていうのは紀元前から非常に大きく受けてるんだなっていうことを発見した。つまりある共通の影響としてその中国文化とインド文化っていうものがあるんだっていうことを発見しました。
Also looking, even if there may be differences between Southeast Asia and East Asia, if we look closely into it, we share the same influences from China and India before BC. Yeah?
で最終的にその一つの作品の中にインドネシアの人たちが知っていたマハーバーラタのあるエピソードっていうのが入ることになりました。
As a result, we decided to have an episode from Mahabharata, the Indonesian version of it, in the piece.
他の東南アジアの人はそのエピソードは知らないというふうに言ってましたね。
And other participants from different parts of from Asia did not know this version of Mahabharata from Indonesia.
今度は日本の演劇の話になるんですけど、日本にはご存知の通り能狂言というのと歌舞伎っていうのが伝統演劇としてあります。
So now we are moving a little bit to the Japanese theater. As you must know, we have traditions of no theater, kyogen, and kabuki.
能と狂言は日本の国内で発達したものなんですけど、その2つの演劇が生まれる前にやはり主に朝鮮半島を通じて中国とかインドの文化物語というものが入ってきてですね、それがもう形が変わらないほど変形しながら能と歌舞伎のストーリーの中に入っているっていうふうに、僕が研究したわけじゃなくてそういうようなことを書いてある本を読みました。
And No and Kyogen developed inside Japan, but before it became No and Kyogen, the influences, the stories actually came through Korean Peninsula from India and China. And these stories didn't really change itself, but were incorporated to become No and Kyogen.
演劇に限らずですね、
And this is not something that I researched, but this is something that I read. すいません。
演劇に限らず日本の文化っていうのは、大陸から入ってくるものを僕は翻訳っていう言葉で呼びたいんですけど、トランスレーションですね。翻訳して自分たちのものにするってことをずっと続けてきたと思うんですね。
So the Japanese theater, not only theater, but Japanese culture actually was continuous sort of translation of things that came from the continent. It was a process of translation and also appropriation of the influences that came from the continent.
例えばその歌舞伎で三味線という楽器を使いますけど、これはテキストではなくて三味線という楽器が沖縄を通じて中国から入ってきた楽器なんですね。で三味線抜きに歌舞伎のパフォーマンスなんていうのは考えられない、つまり音楽的な影響も受けてるんですね。
If we look at kabuki, we used an instrument called shamisen, and this instrument came from China through Okinawa. And without shamisen, it wouldn't be kabuki. So it's not only theater, but also musically, we have these influences from the continent.
で明治時代ですから今から140年前ぐらいになりますと、今度はアジアからの影響っていうのは一切遮断してですね、その西洋の文化の影響っていうのを取り入れていく、翻訳していくってことになります。
And in the Meiji era, which is about 140 years ago, now we shut ourselves off from the influences of Asia, and we started to take influences from the West and translate these influences.
で1900年だから20世紀に入るとシェイクスピアとかイプセンの翻訳っていうのが始まりまして、その翻訳劇を上演するっていうのが日本の近代劇新劇のスタートみたいな風になってます。
So in the 20th century, we started to translate plays by Shakespeare and Ibsen, and these plays started to be performed, and this became the 近代演劇って英語だと今 modern theater in Japan.
ここでこういうその翻訳を通じて何をやってるかというと、多分その新しい文体というか表現方法っていうのをその外国のものを取り入れながら生み出してるんだと思うんですよね。
So what we do here through translation is actually to come up with new ways of expression, but by translating foreign materials.
でこの新劇が20世紀の頭で始まった時にそのテクストを翻訳してっていうこと以外にその女優というのも生まれるんですね。
Also, when we started having this modern theater in the beginning of 20th century, not only did we translate these plays, but also this concept of actress was born.
近代演劇の始まりを作った一人の幼い薫っていう人がいますけど、その人は歌舞伎役者と一緒にイプセンのジョン・ガブリエル・ボルクマンって芝居を上演してます。ですので芝居のこの先の中に出てくる女のキャラクターっていうのは女方によって演じられてるんですね。つまり男によって演じられている。
One of the founders of modern theater in Japan, Osanai Kaoru, worked with a kabuki actor to realize Ibsen's John Gabriel Borkman. And there, the female character was performed by the female impersonator of kabuki actor, which is basically a male playing the female role.
それからちょっと後になって松井須磨子という女優が出てきてイプセンの、ノラとかハムレットのオフィーリアっていうのを演じて、これが近代劇の中の女優の最初みたいな風になってます。
彼女が女優だったってことです。
そうですね。
And then later we have an actress called Matsui Sumako who played Nora in Ibsen's piece or Ophelia in Hamlet, and this sort of became the prototype of an actress in modern theater in Japan.
ですのでこの時にはその西洋の女性を日本の女性が演じるっていうことがスタートしたということですね。
So the starting point of this was play of a Japanese Japanese woman playing a Western woman.
でこういうようなその西洋の演劇の影響を受けるながら演劇を革新していくっていうのが1960年代まで続きます。
And this sort of process of making our own theater by appropriating Western theater continued on until the 60s.
1960年代の後半になると、ペーターなんかがよく知っているそのアングラ小劇場というの運動が始まってですね、この時にその日本の前近代的な芸能歌舞伎であったり能であったりのスタイルを取り入れるということが始まってですね、実際のその小劇場演劇の、リーダー作り手たちはとても強く西洋演劇に影響されていたんですけど、実際に作る作品はその歌舞伎的な様式とか日本の前近代的な芸能を取り入れたものを作り始めました。
And in the late 60s, as Peter must know, the underground small theater scene started to blossom. And actually, the makers of these underground small theaters were very much influenced by Western theater, but they were the ones that decided to go back to pre-modern theater in Japan. So they started to study and take the forms of kabuki and no and kyogen, for example.
で80年代ぐらいに入るとあんまりその外国の演劇の強い影響を受けて自分たちの演劇を新しくしていくっていうような動きはこう下火になっちゃいましたね。
And by the 80s, this sort of attempt to create new forms of theater by studying or translating foreign theater sort of started to be less, it started to be less influence.
なので僕が最初に話したその、世田谷パブリックシアターでのコラボレーションとか他にもいろいろその日本の演劇と海外の演劇人が一緒に作品作る動きが1990年代ぐらいから起きたんですけど、それがその一つ新しい日本の演劇の、自己改革といいますか、そういうものの基盤を成しているのかなというふうに思います。
So just like the example that I shared with you in the beginning about this collaboration project we did at Setagaya Public Theater, since the 90s, the ways for us to search for new ways of theater in Japan has been more to collaborate with people from overseas to sort of self-revolutionize ourselves.
あと一つだけ、昨日もいろいろクローズドで議論をしてたんですけど、そのドラマトゥルクとかいうものをあるこう専門的な役割として演劇作りの中に取り入れようというのも、そのハンスティース・レーマンなんかが書いたポストドラマ演劇の影響が大きいと思うんですけど、その外国の演劇の方法論みたいなものを取り入れて日本の演劇を新しくしていこうっていう動きの一つの表れかなというふうに思います。
Also, we had in the close discussions yesterday about this sort of the concept of specific expertise of a dramaturg. And so that's sort of also another way where we try to incorporate methodologies from overseas and then sort of revolutionize our own self.
Okay, well, thank you all for your really wonderful presentations. I think each of the presentations opened up on the question of Asian dramaturgical practices in some quite remarkable ways. And in the discussion now, we need to try and find some threads, I think, that might possibly link some of the experiences of dramaturgical practice or indeed do something quite opposite to that and identify quite different contexts and quite different practices. Just to stimulate the discussion, I've tried to make some notes of some of the perspectives, and one of the things that I was really taken by was this very powerful relationship between history and memory here in the panel, because all of you were talking about theatre histories that are very associated with the identification of nation, the identification of culture, the identification of tradition, and indeed the identification of modernity. But those histories were all inflected through memory, and memories of particular artists, memories of particular works, and indeed memories of particular collaborations that you, in some cases, participated in to make those works. So I think there's a really interesting point there between, the kind of more narratological understanding of history that is something that may well create a certain kind of notion of dramaturgy as a structure that is authoritarian, perhaps, or that is imposed upon us by the weight of history. But then there's that's interrupted, I think, by the possibility of memory and very subjective and personal experiences that you might relate to. Second one is this relationship to foundational figures and relational and foundation histories. Each of you spoke, I think, very powerfully to histories of theatre within culture, within particular societies, cultures and communities at particular times. And I think that there's something very important about these relationships to figures such as Kaupal Kun and Krishin Jit and Suzuki Tadashi and Teriyama Shuji and Rendra and so on and so forth. But this also takes us down the path of the guru figure as well. And to what extent are these figures aligning us to a history that we can't escape from. A personal anecdote, I'm very struck as an Australian who moved to New York 3 years ago by how much the theatre there is overwhelmingly controlled by the memory of the 60s. And I feel that young artists are really trapped by that constant recirculation of these memories. On the other hand, many of the figures you've mentioned have been very influential in your own theatre communities and have inspired the next generation of artists and so on and so forth. So there is a dramaturgical lineage of work that you can trace through the work of certain artists. But there's also, I think, a question to be asked about how those kind of lineages become the sort of singular authoritative voice, and how there's a need to work against them as well. The third one was a concern with language and the ruptures of language. All of you talked about languages, I think, not just the language of a play text or the spoken languages in the complicated multicultural environments of your communities, but you also talked of the need for theatre to move into an awareness of other kinds of language, perhaps vocabularies of the body, vocabularies of gender, vocabularies of an awareness of who is in the theatre and who is not, and also the audience and their literacy and their understanding of theatre and the way that theatre has to engage with and perhaps develop a certain kind of literacy among audiences. So there was a strong emphasis on gender, there was a strong emphasis on cultural politics, there's a strong emphasis on identity politics, which is interesting because a number of you pointed to the 1980s as a crucial time, which is also the time of the rise of cultural politics and in international terms, and the rise of identity politics that gives us some of the kind of theoretical perspectives that lead to much of this kind of critique. Japan is a kind of exception here because the deeply radical time of the theatre was the 1960s when, as Kentaro said, all of these ruptures happened in a very deep and profound way, whereas the 1980s was the period of the bubble economy, the time of economic excess. And this also brings us to the relationship that a number of you mentioned to economy, and how there is certain kind of connections between periods of theatrical activity and a cultural context and also an economic context that produces that. Very important, I think, in relation to maybe the question of whether or not dramaturgy will be co-opted by state institutions seeking to reframe dramaturgy as a kind of cultural industry modality, bring in the dramaturg to train the artist to produce successful outcomes kind of mentality. And I think, that's something we might consider. Of course, I'm, as a dramaturg myself, I'm very much keen on notions of reconfiguring, notions of rupture, notions of remaking histories, notions that you all mentioned, certain kinds of interruptions to narratives, certain kinds of possibilities for making some kind of new intervention, some kind of new point through the active understanding of how theatre engages in social, political and cultural debates, whether it's didactically engaging with themes that are unfolding in those communities, or whether it's making visible people in the theatre who were invisible before, making new kinds of relationships to tradition, such as the traditional theatre in Japan did in the 60s, or whether it's creating hybrid contexts for theatre and performance. And then finally, I think, Marion mentioned the cultural, was it Marion who mentioned the cultural producer? Yeah, creative producer, apologies. And I think on a certain level, when we're talking about dramaturgy in the contemporary era, we're always talking about this relationship to a cultural production, whether it's a cultural producer who activates this. Matsui-san was talking about collaboration within the Asian cultural sphere in the 1990s. And this also reminds me of the fact that this was the great era of intercultural theatre, where this was not just a process that was happening across Asian cultures, but also it was, in a sense, a period where, you know, the monumental artists from the 60s in the West came to Asia to discover their Oriental other side or something, and made those performances that we all know about. And if Rustam Baracha was here, he'd be critiquing them in furiously, as he's always done. So they're just a couple of points that I think we've come, you know, that have been raised in this really rich series of presentations. We've now got, our task is to try and unpick a little bit this idea of an Asian dramaturgy. I don't know whether you are willing or wanting to go to that concept in some way. How might we address the potentiality of that term? I think moving from your individual examples into a conversation between the examples, and how might we also engage in a kind of critique of that term? Because critique was another important word that was mentioned a lot in the presentation. So would anybody like to begin the conversation there? Perhaps, you know, with a question about, perhaps maybe you have a question of another presenter about their presentation, or, yeah. We need to use the mics.
Yeah, that's good. Inadvertently, we're talking about different pedagogies that emerge. And I want to go back, therefore, to ask Anuradha this question about, in the specific tradition of Indian work that you talked about, there is a Guru Shishya space. And Kentaro is also referring to certain ways in which teaching occurs about Japanese tradition, if I heard it sort of correctly, which provides some kind of very solid base that, say, we in Malaysia, Singapore don't have the claim to in the same sort of way. And so we're not considered Asia sometimes because, you know, when people are looking for Asian culture from a Western or non-Asian perspective, even within Asia, it's too much of a mix for it to be really Asian. We're not exotic enough, and we're not pure enough. Thank you. So what happens to the role of pedagogy, even if we don't think about Guru Shishya, in these spaces that have these strong things to contend with and oppositions, therefore, to also percolate in what you're doing, which I think really in Malaysia and Singapore is we're relatively free from. And whether that's a good thing or bad thing, I'm not going to say, but I think it affects the way dramaturgies emerge. And so, yeah, I just wanted to ask you both to.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the positions that could be, one of the areas that, somebody like myself, both as a practitioner and as a pedagogue, would think is to constantly underline the fact that authenticity is actually quite recent in most forms, particularly the form presently that is seen as the Indian form, that's Bharatanatyam, is late 1930s, 40s. And other forms that are seen as Indian heralds are in the 1950s. So it's an invention of tradition at a particular kind. And I think as a pedagogue, that would be important, and as a theatre educator or as even a practitioner, to say that there is not one resource from which you draw. But I think the other part would be that authenticity as even a notion that, is, in fact, has to be cut every time by the fact that all Indian bodies don't perform in the same way. And that is an experience that I, as a director or as a teacher, have had non-stop. So, I mean, for instance, something that is in any theatre teaching institute, which body are you creating? Is this an Indian body, primarily North Indian body, primarily Hindi-speaking body? I mean, it's an ongoing problem. And I think the problem has to be addressed by not making it invisible and constantly saying that there is no one way. I mean, I just want to move a little to say, for instance, Hindi as spoken now in India, one part of Hindi is Sanskritized, never spoken ever. It's a constructed language that runs on the radio. So there is hardly anything that's written in that Hindi. Hindi, as we know it, is a mix of various dialects. And in the way that we've constructed this All India Radio, Hindi has pulled out dialects totally. And so what we now have is a dead language. Nobody writes in it. The Hindi that's spoken is Bollywood. And I think that's important, that we should say that that's the popular one. And there's another little thing which is part of a kind of notion of Hindi being Hindus speak Hindi, is another sort of interesting typographical thing that has been introduced in the 1980s, again 1980s, is that there is a dot in the writing of Hindi that produces the word z or kh, which is part of Urdu. Now, after the right-wing movement, it was removed. So you don't say, you've forgotten, young people have forgotten to say kha. So it's become that you've taken out the Arabic sound, the Urdu sound out of Hindi. So you have a construction once again. So I think these part of historical ruptures and manipulations or translations, I think would be part of a pedagogic relationship, I think.
Before I pass to Kentaro. Oh, sure. Yeah, I think inevitably the pedagogy changes. The context is different, the time is different, the number of hours you have with the student is different. So for example, I learned classical Malay dance in a particular way. And when I teach the exact same dance, I'm teaching it differently from the way my guru taught me. I break it down more because I have X number of hours to get that. Whereas with my guru, there was, 4,000 gazillion hours. And you have a syllabus, and you have 14 weeks, and so on and so forth. So you break it down, and you make it into little, nuggets that a 19-year-old can grasp. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, because I'm not sure, especially very specifically, let's say, classical Malay dance, I'm not sure how much embodiment then there is, because we are forced to change the pedagogy, and we have got to do it in the 14 weeks, etc. So when I look eventually at what the student has achieved and think about my own embodiment of that particular dance, it's like, okay, so that's, but inevitably the pedagogy has to change. The context is different, the time is different, everything is different. And if we're still going to, at least in Malaysia, if we're going to maintain that, it's impossible. So that's why it's very interesting for me to see how when Mayong is being taught, you have the guru and the young lecturer teaching together. And that's a very interesting dynamic going on there, and how much then the students gain from both systems.
そのコーパー君とかクリスチェン・ジットというグルの話が出ましたけど、僕は1998年の頭に彼らに初めて会ったんですね。でとてもそれ以来その2人には大きな影響を受けて、で皆さんのお話にあったように、その日本と比べた場合、東南アジアの他の アジアの他の国は文化の多様性というか複数性というかそういうものがこう明らかに目に見えてあるわけですね。で日本はすごくモノカルチャーというかそういうふうに思われてるわけですけどパウ君とかクリスチャンと会ってですね僕は教わったのはその日本の中でもすごくそういう文化の複数性みたいなものが自分たちの根っこにあってこれは見えないように眠ってるんですけど彼らと出会って刺激を受けることでそれが活性化したというようなことが一つあります。
The names that Ko-Pao-kun and Christian did were mentioned as some of the gurus. Also, I've met them in the beginning of the 80s, and I was very much influenced by them as well. Especially in the aspect that we tend to think that Japan is much more monocultural compared to other parts of Asia, which is much more multicultural. But by meeting them, I was taught that at the root of the Japanese culture, we have multiple cultures, and they are basically sleeping. But by meeting with them, I was inspired to be aware of this multicultural aspects of Japan.
でシャレンが言ったそのオープンカルチャーみたいな新しいこのスフィアっていうのかなそこに自分たちも飛び込んでいこうみたいなことをちょっと後押しされたっていう感じがあります。
So I was encouraged by them to jump into this sort of new sphere of open culture that Charlene, for example, mentioned.
あと日本の固有の問題としてはその教育というか修行といいますか1970年代80年代ぐらいまではその劇団シアターカンパニーというのは京子にあってそこの劇団の中で先輩からしごかれていろんなものをこう身体的に習得していくというようなことがまだ現代演劇においてもあったんですね。ところがその先ほどペーターが言ったみたいにバブルエコノミーとか日本でいうとそのポストモダンみたいな概念が一般的に言われるようになった後その劇団が演劇を作る母体となるというようなシステムが徐々にこう崩れ出した。それ以降その日本には正式な演劇の教育機関というのがないので演劇を体丸ごと学んで習得していくみたいな場っていうのが喪失しかけてるかなということは思います。
Also, if we were to talk about very specific situation about this sort of the issues of pedagogy or training in Japan, in the 70s and 80s, we can say that we have very strong bases of these different theaters, which trained the actors and the artists within these theaters. So in these theaters, if you belong to a theater, then you very much your elders would train you really rigorously, and your body, the whole body transforms through being part of this theater group. But as Peter mentioned, in the 90s, we will go into this sort of bubble economy and also this concept of postmodernism. So no longer these theater groups became the body of theater making necessarily. And so that sort of system collapsed. And now we don't have any sort of official educational institution for theater training. So we don't have this opportunity to really train the whole body of this sort of transforming bodies of the theater.
僕はブラックテンティアターカンパニーってとこにのメンバーだったんですけどそのブラックテントは幸いなことに80年にフィリピンのペタと共同作業したんですね。それで僕はそのパオ君とかジットの前にペタのメンバーに会って彼らと、僕はそんなに深く付き合ったわけではないんですけどいろんな刺激を受けたということがあってそういう意味じゃ非常にラッキーだった。だから日本の劇団とフィリピンの劇団が真っ向から何か違う方法論でぶつかり合って現場にいられたんでそこでも何か得たなということはありました。
I was a member of the Black Tent Theater Company, and so in the 80s, we had a lot of exchange with PETA from the Philippines. So before meeting with Pao-kun or JIT, I was actually had these opportunities to encounter members of PETA. And that was very much inspirational for us, for me, myself as well. And I feel that I was very lucky because I was in the middle of this Japanese theater company and Philippine theater company somehow negotiating their different methodologies in the theater, and there was a lot to gain from this.
Yeah, I just want to go back to something that you mentioned, Peter, on the foundational figures. I like that term, the foundational figures. I think it's changing, and in a healthy way. I think it really depends on who you have sitting here. So you have us. I'm 63, so and I won't reveal the ages of the rest. So yeah, my reference is what happened in the 80s because that's when I started making work. But if you have a different group of people here, their references for Malaysia would be Mark Tay, Joko Kertas, and Loh Kok Man. That's happening, and that's good. So I think in Malaysia, at least, yes, there's a certain amount of deification maybe of Christian, but I think we've let him die already. It's been 11, 12 years, and he's dead. And I think I think we've let him go. June is like cringing there, but I think we have, at least in Malaysia, I think really we have. I don't know about the rest of the world. And it really depends who is up here and who then the reference points. And I just want to ask Charlene before I go to the loo, yeah, I'm an old woman. I'm a pea queen. Charlene and I were talking last night, and she talked about the history of the word Asian, which I really think you need to talk about, Charlene, because then that's the end of this whole symposium. Sorry, I have to go to the loo. Sorry. I should sit at the end.
So when I was trying to think about this panel, I'm the kind who has to write things down, so that's why I have to refer to this. I looked up the word Asian, which I don't think I'd ever done before. And I was quite shocked at what I found. I didn't go very deep into this, but basically it seemed to suggest that the etymology of the word is Greek, uncertain, most likely Greek, going back to 440 BC and Herodotus. I think that's how you pronounce his name, Greek philosopher who was trying to mark out people and places towards the east that were not quite Egypt and Greek. There be dragons, Peter says. I'm born in the year of the dragon. Me be dragon. And so then I thought, what are we asking ourselves? Because is there an Asian dramaturgy? So dramaturgy is not quite Asian word. Then Asian is not Asian word. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot by going there. But having said that, my next point to myself was, I'm not going to deny the currency of the word and the fact that we're here operating within a certain framework that has a more recent history of Asian values, Asian food, a currency that we're buying into. I'm not denying that. I'm complicit in that attractiveness of something that is defined as Asian. And yes, I am Asian. But a lot of that has to do with my context. And I think that for me, again, it was a reminder that even the origin of the word is about where's this place. And the fact that we still struggle, as I was saying yesterday, with West Asia being Asian. They're not even here because there are difficulties in proving that they're a valid part of Asia. I ask my students sometimes when we do work that has to do with this word Asian, is Israel in Asia? And if you're in Singapore, that's a huge question to ask because there are very specific politics about that. And they go, no. Then I said, but is Palestine in Asia? then they know, okay, it's nearby. So if we say no, then it's a bit difficult. And it's complicated. I'm not saying I know exactly where Asia begins and ends. And then, of course, now there's Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and, all that Central Asia, which we also, don't acknowledge, admit, and perform as Asia. So the dramaturgies that can be even admitted into the question of, we're still asking, what's East and not Greek and Egypt? So the provocation for me in my head was then, all right, I'll go towards a kind of particularity that I understand and can speak to, which is the multiplicity of Singapore, Malaysia, or Malaya in the old-fashioned sense of it. And I think this question needs to not deny that Asian is a word that we use and we use intelligently, I'm not denying that, but sometimes our ignorance allows us a bliss that is dangerous, really, really dangerous, myself included.
Well, yes, thank you. And I think you've raised a very important point. I'd add to this complexity of terms. Yeah, we've got the time. Two other factors. I think that the contemporary understanding of dramaturgy assumes a certain kind of cosmopolitanism, both in its positive and negative. I'm thinking of Nikos Papastygiannis's use of cosmopolitanism as a very progressive idea in the arts, as a way of understanding and progressing and not just negotiating difference, but celebrating difference, I think, in a really important political way. So there's a certain kind of cosmopolitanism that is associated with the use of the term dramaturgy, because it is theoretically open to those kind of thinking about pluralities and possibilities and diversities and also ruptures and difference. Dramaturgy takes us to those questions because it makes art remind us of the potentiality of art to be at the site of negotiating those differences. I guess the other side of that is globalization and the critique of globalization, because as we've not really interrogated here, and perhaps we don't want to, there is a kind of cultural industry imperative around the term dramaturgy now that I think we need to be alive to. And that perhaps we could do a panel on that specifically as a topic, because I don't know that it needs to impinge on the richness of the political positionings of each of the speakers today, because I think it, in some ways, that kind of debate overrides the complexity of individual situations. But I just put it out there. We have 25 minutes left now. Because being an academic, I speak too much. And we're going to turn it to the floor. So we invite questions from the floor in English or Japanese, or I guess we could probably deal with other languages as well and translate them. Please wait for the radio mic to come over to you, and perhaps if you could identify yourself when you...
Are we translating everything into Japanese, or are we doing the same?
Well, actually, yeah, you wanted that to happen, didn't you? Yeah. So just before we take the question, if there are people in the room, like yesterday, Japanese speakers, who would like to hear a translation of the question, it's going to be a little bit interesting in terms of mobility, but if you could come and sit and gather around this corner of the room. Anybody who wants to do that, if you could just move there quickly now with your chair and just sit there, and you'll be able to have a translation.
So I'll be
Yeah,
whispering
yeah, please.
here.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
これから質疑応答に入るんですけれども、逐次で通訳をするのではなくって、もしその英語で交わされていることを日本語にしてほしいという方がいらっしゃったら、ちょっと難しいんですけど、こっちに来ていただいてウィスパリングをするというように進められたらいいなという提案なんですね。必要な方もしいらしたら、ちょっとこっちの方に来ていただけますか。大丈夫かな。
これは大丈夫ですか。Okay, yes. Right. Okay, so we'll take the question, please. Thank you.
Is this switch on? My name is Anuradha Roy, and my question is, really I was it's wonderful to hear about all the nuances that we sort of heard about within the word dramaturgy, and that we choose to question it and re-question it. And I'm just wondering about the inclusion of form within the word dramaturgy, because all the cultures, the histories, the backgrounds represented, of course, are not talking about one single form. And since there are so many various forms, the masked actor, the dancer, the mover, I'm specifically interested in the puppeteer and puppet theater. Would dramaturgy then change from one form to another? And what would be the dynamics of that? It would be very interesting to hear a little bit of what they'd say.
Do you have a particular speaker who you'd like to direct the question to, or shall we just
Anyone
take it to the panel?
Anyone.
Anybody?
Thank you, Anurupa. I think it would change, and I think that perhaps addressing one part of what was just said about a cultural imperative, about dramaturgy as something that seems to be able to address all things at all times. I think perhaps that it shouldn't become something like that. One would have to see it as a series of strategies which deal with particular material, and then also make a decision in which way that material and the performance and the spectator are going to relate. So I think it would be important to factor in the fact that they are not one kind of actioning, but there would be several kinds, I think.
No, it's nothing to add.
Thank you. Another question, please.
Hi, my name is Ugo, and I'm very interested with the since yesterday it feels like an ongoing conversation, and we become more and more specific, and at the same time, at the end, we have again, I think Peter put it well in terms of how we think about Asia, right? Like this is more like a comment rather than a question, but. I keep on, because I keep on looking at that word of roots and tradition, right? And Peter talked about rhizome yesterday, and what is rhizome but interconnecting root. And also within the panel, we talk about pedagogy a lot, we talk about transmission a lot, which is the etymology of the word tradition, is it? I like that possibility, I mean, that two possibility of thinking through rhizome and thinking to tradition not as a fixed point, but as a sense of movement, because it's transmission, and Marion talked about it has to change, pedagogy has to change, which is that the kind of question that we need to think about, whether now our fixed point has to change, right? Like there is we have to have a fluid fixed point rather than a fixed point of origin, so to speak. Yeah, we talk about the possibility of Asia as something that is being constructed, but also I think it is good to remember that globalization is not made by colonialization, right? It was taking place before that. Asia has already experienced globalization before the arrival of Tommy Porras from Portugal in 1511 in Singapore. So it's already way, way beyond that. Global exchange has already taken place before that. I mean, in that sense, Charlene talked about not being exotic enough. I think seeing something as being exotic enough is very much perpetuating some kind of colonial gaze rather than the real. So I think this is the kind of struggle that we have to do in thinking about dramaturgy in Asia, right? Like where to put that notions of origin, where to put that the notions of exotism and so on and so forth. we talk a lot about the dramaturgy that we do, and I'm also thinking mostly about dramaturgy that taking place on us, right? The dramaturgy that Peter talked about, the whole world, the shape of the world post-World War. I'm not trying to expose my age, but I keep on thinking about 1950s as the point of origin in theater in Asia somehow. And then the whole reconfigurations of global politics in southern part of the world, right? Post World War II, in the beginning of Cold War, because within one region we have communist genocide in Indonesia and communist murders in the same within the Southeast Asia. So it's like two set of extreme one another, and how it clearly shaped performance history that I know. I think in Indonesia it clearly restructured our dramaturgical idea. And yes, yeah, that's my...
It's a series of comments, and I think they're very interesting. Would the panel like to address any aspect of that? Touching very widely, I think, on histories, globalization, traditions, transmission of traditions.
Your comments are very interesting, and something that I just want to add, that there is a history, as we all know, of the Bandung, and which is something that India has completely forgotten. Right, and it's something that the fact that the Bandung actually was an active movement talking about an international platform, and it had something to do with the fact that, for instance, post that, India never makes a relationship with either Africa or Arab countries, and that there was a magazine that was edited by the Pakistani great writer Faiz Ahmed Faiz, while in Beirut. So I mean, it's a history that's been totally erased very quickly, very quickly. So I mean,
as you were talking, many things were happening in my head, but one of the things that struck me, which I just want to mention, is it's almost as if we have to start incorporating into our consciousness a dramaturgy of tourism.
yeah.
Because that's impacting us more than I am willing to admit, I'll be honest. Yet it's huge. From festivals to performances to funding, to as well as how we apprehend the dynamics and the in-between spaces even. And I don't think we sufficiently raise that. So it comes out of that cosmopolitan globalization discoursing, which tends to underrate, I think, how tourism has become, I mean, on the one hand insidious, but on the other hand, enchanting.
Another question. We've got 10 minutes to go. So get your questions lined up.
Hi, I'm Pang from Malaysia. I'm not a dramaturg, so I apologize for this question. I feel like I'm an ally who has stepped into a support group meeting for dramaturgs. So, but I'm very charmed by it. So thank you for allowing me to ask this question. I'm very fascinated by the point you made earlier about how the state may adopt dramaturgs, but to some degree, I think it might have already happened, right? And whether consciously or unconsciously, I think, for example, when some dramaturgy focuses too much on notions of, exploring notions of race and ethnicities, they end up reinstalling the traditions of the creation of these categories by states. And I think part of our roots and traditions is also, in Asia particularly, is about roots and traditions of authoritarianism, dictatorship, and all those kind of things that have created these categories that we are now deploying in our dramaturgy, you see. So I'm wondering in what ways sometimes dramaturgy reinforces some of these, the states. And on the other hand, though, I'm thinking those of us here who have been actually assimilated, sorry for using the word assimilated, who have been employed by the state in various degrees to maybe organize festivals. How can we use dramaturgy within the state's logic? Can it disrupt the state? Can the state be the audience? What tool can dramaturgy be for the state?
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, Keng Sen addressed many of the things that you're talking about. So when that becomes available online, it would be very valuable to watch it. In brief, it's a valid question nonetheless. I'm really saying it seriously. It'll be valuable to watch it. But in brief, I think, yes, the politics of whoever is doing the dramaturgy can make the state very much the targeted audience of sorts, in which the intent is to surface a dialogue, a performance that would otherwise be invisible. And sometimes, of course, the politics of the dramaturg or whoever's doing the dramaturgy is to reinforce and to carry out the syllabus, make sure the curriculum is completed in 14 weeks or less. And yeah, so whether one is employed by the state or not, I think these things are very real. But I don't think we sufficiently make them transparent. So that's another thing that came up in the discussion yesterday with Keng Sen. To what extent can we make them transparent, whoever we are, and to what extent is there even interest in that transparency? Because sometimes you make them transparent, people go, I don't want to know, because you're making my life unhappy. And so transparency may be this ideal and this utopia for some of us who feel, this is all very important from a certain political left, non-neoliberal point of view. But then for other people, it's unpleasant rupture, undesirable rupture.
Yeah, and at the same time, there's a lot of subversion that can be done in 14 weeks. So, it can work in so many ways. At the end of the day, the individual or the company or what, there are so many ways to use whatever systems you have, systems of the state, to subvert the state. Even things like censorship. And, there are many ways. Like yesterday, there was an example of how people dealt with censorship. Who was it who was talking about? Ruhani, I think. Or Keng Sen. Yeah, and Rohani. And we've done the same thing where there's censorship and then you display the censorship. And in one, very quick example where, again, the state, had made us cut a lot of material. So what we did was we put in the lobby of the theater all the pages of the script which had been censored. And said, this has been censored. And we had a Q&A after that to explain the whole process of all the meetings with the authorities. And the authorities came and were so happy to see that their work had been carried out. So it was, really, because they said, we did it, right? We said, yes, we will do this, and this is what they've. So they was pleased as punch. So there was like triple layer of subversion going on there. And just very quickly, I want to just go back to form. I just want to go back to form. I think, yes, of course, I think the kind of dramaturgy changes, but when one says then we have to think about form, then one presupposes that we know that this is a particular form. But more and more so, I think practitioners are making work which is so inter and multidisciplinary that there is a blurring of form. I know for my own work, I really don't know what I'm making anymore in terms of form, but I do know that I am making performance. So so it's a little slippery there, because do we know exactly, oh, this is film, this is dance, this is theater, this is music, when there's just so much. And in all the traditional theater, not just in Asia, but in the West as well, that, weaving of dance, theater, music, film, was very fluid. And this kind of separation that here is dance and here is theater is something that we need to think about.
コーパー君のことに戻るんですが、コーパー君のことをちょっと書こうとしたときに、参考にした本で、エドワード・サイードの知識人についての役割を書いた本があって、その知識人というのはあらゆる社会の中心にはいかずに、そのマージナルなところにいて、いずれの文化にも帰属しないみたいな、いずれの立場にも社会のオーセンティックな立場を代弁しない。で生き続けるみたいなことを書いていて、パオ君がそういうような役割を果たしてたんじゃないかなと思うんで、ドラマトゥルクっていうのも芝居を作る上で、そういう役割を果たすべきだなと、僕自身日本の政府がやってる助成金の審査みたいなものに関わってますけど、そういうサイードが述べるみたいな知識人の立場、スタンディングポイントみたいなものをキープするのが実に難しいなと思います。
Just to go back to the Ko Pao-kun, he was talking about he mentioned this thinking by Edward Said. Yes, that about the role of intellectuals, and that the role of intellectual is not to stay in the center of a society, but always to put themselves in the marginal part of a society, and never to belong to anything, and never to represent anything as authentic. So I think that has to, for myself, I think that's the role of a dramaturg. And for example, in Japan, I'm also part of selecting, sometimes I do selection, I'm part of a selection committee for funding in Japan, and I realize that it is very difficult to put myself in that standpoint of that Said mentioned.
Thank you.
あと昨日のディスカッションで僕自身がドラマトゥルクとかドラマ剣っていう言葉を使って自分の役割を評価するのは嫌だっていうふうに述べたんですけど、一方でアリストテールがグリークトラジェディの理論を書いたわけですよね。でもあれってギリシャ悲劇のほんの一部のことしか語ってなくて、コロスとかお面をつけてやるとかそういうところは全部そぎ落とされちゃってるんですよね。なんでギリシャ悲劇の原型を考えたら日本のノーシアターとそっくりなわけで、だから西洋の人たちが西洋演劇、ドラマ演劇を規定する規定っていうのはものすごく狭くて、ちょっとそれはいびつだなというふうに思うんですね。だからそういう観点から考えれば、ドラマとかドラマ剣ないしは演劇っていうふうに言った方がいいのかもしれませんけど、それはそれほど西と東洋と西洋、アジアっていうのと違いがあるかなっていうと、オリジンではそう違いがないんじゃないかなと思ったりもします。
Also, just one more thing. Yesterday in the closed session that I mentioned that I don't feel comfortable calling myself a dramaturg or even using the term dramaturgy for what I do. If we take the Aristotelian Yeah, the Aristotelian. I don't know how to say it in English. In his theory or in his study of Greek theater, when he takes on the subject of Greek tragedy, he actually skips many of the aspects of Greek tragedy, including the issues of cholos, for example, or the use of mask. And if you actually closely look into the origin of Greek theater, we have a lot in common with, for example, with no theater. So when this sort of the discussion that's going on in the West about how do we define not only maybe dramaturgy or dramaturg, but also in the wider sense of theater, it's very much sort of it's very limited and it's very skewed as well.
Well, I think in some ways you've taken us back to the beginnings, the idea of roots, the idea of tradition, and connected it to the possibility of a dramaturgy that is shared among many places and times, and is certainly something that is always existing within all aspects of performance, whether it's performance in India, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, or elsewhere. I also think that there's something very important about this question of dramaturgy enacting its own sense of visible politics, through the form. The form speaks to an audience in certain kinds of ways. You've all spoken to that point very powerfully, I think. And it's my personal opinion, at least, that the importance of dramaturgy is that it makes that form visible within the theatrical production. It makes things visible. And you've all spoken about that importance, I think, of theatre making things visible for the audience. Dramaturgy reminds us of the power of theatre to do that. It gives us certain techniques and technologies to do that. And in a way, it gives us a role within the theatre that might be called a dramaturg, it might be called a director, it might be called a cultural producer, who enlivens that process in the making of the work and delivers us that to an audience. So, if we were to think about that, I think then we have a certain point that is that we've all been talking about in some respects. So we are out of time, so it's my pleasure now to thank our very distinguished panel today and such a wonderful discussion. So. Thank you very much.